A millionaire rescued a deaf homeless girl and took her into his home. The next day, he lost a large sum of money. The midday sun bathed San Diego in a golden glow, painting the city's bustling streets in hues of warmth and activity. The hum of life echoed through the sidewalks, the sharp clicks of heels on pavement, the low rumble of distant traffic, bursts of laughter spilling from outdoor cafes. Yet, amidst this vibrancy, Julie felt only silence. Her small hands brushed against the rough edge of a trash bin, the metal cold and unforgiving. The smooth vibrations from a nearby bus rolling to a stop passed through her feet, a faint reminder of a world she couldn't fully grasp. Julie, 10 years old and deaf, had learned to rely on everything but sound. She glanced up, squinting against the sunlight, scanning faces for a hint of kindness. Most people passed without a second look. Others frowned, their lips moving in words she couldn't hear but could feel: annoyance, dismissal. Her stomach growled. She pressed a hand against it, trying to calm the hollow ache. Reaching further into the bin, her fingers found a crumpled sandwich wrapper. Empty. She pulled back, her shoulders sagging. The pavement felt uneven beneath her worn sneakers as she moved toward a quieter corner of the street. A man sat on a nearby bench, his phone glued to his ear, gesturing animatedly. Across the road, a group of teenagers joked loudly, their carefree movements a stark contrast to Julie's slow, deliberate steps. She paused, scanning their faces, watching for a moment she might slip past unnoticed to grab a discarded soda can. She hesitated. Too many people. She turned back toward the alley. The shadows there seemed safer, a pocket of anonymity where eyes wouldn't follow her. But her movements drew someone's attention. From the glossy window of his sleek black car, Gabriel watched. The noise of the city faded into a background hum as he focused on the girl. Her thin frame moved with cautious determination, her head turning sharply at every motion around her. She wasn't in a panic. She was well versed in her surroundings. Gabriel thought grimly that she was a survivalist. The car idled at the curb, but Gabriel wasn't looking at his watch or checking his phone. His gaze stayed fixed on Julie. She had stopped by another trash bin, her small fingers methodically brushing away bits of debris as she searched. A man in a blue jacket walked by, muttering something as his eyes darted toward her. Julie flinched and pulled her hand back. Gabriel opened the car door. "Wait," his driver called out, confusion in his voice. "Do you need something here?" Gabriel didn't answer. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the soft leather of his shoes barely sounding against the pavement. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit as he approached, blending into the city's flow until he was a few feet away from her. Julie froze when she noticed him. Her gaze darted to his face, his neatly trimmed beard and sharp blue eyes, then quickly down to his polished shoes. Her shoulders tightened. He crouched slightly, putting himself at her level, and spoke softly. "You hungry?" She stared at his lips, catching the movement. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Strangers asking questions rarely meant kindness. Her head tilted, her expression wary. Gabriel, sensing her hesitation, reached into his pocket and pulled out a wrapped granola bar. He extended it toward her, his movements deliberate, non-threatening. "For you," he said, making sure she could see his lips. Julie's eyes flickered between him and the granola bar. Her stomach growled again, louder this time. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took it. The crinkle of the wrapper against her fingertips made her pause. Could she trust this? "Eat," he said, smiling gently. "It's safe." Her fingers worked at the wrapper, her eyes darting up to his face every few seconds. She took a small bite, the sweetness almost overwhelming after days of hunger. Her chewing slowed as she studied him. Gabriel straightened slightly, giving her space, but not stepping away. "My name's Gabriel," he said slowly, ensuring each word was clear. "You don't have to stay here. Come with me." Julie frowned, her brow furrowing as she tried to decipher his meaning. His voice, though gentle, was meaningless noise to her, but his expression, steady, warm, carried weight. "Safe," he added, gesturing to his car parked nearby. Her gaze followed his hand, then returned to his face. The words didn't matter as much as his presence did. She took another bite of the granola bar, her movement still hesitant. Trust wasn't something she gave easily, but something in his eyes softened her resistance. Slowly, Julie nodded. Gabriel extended his hand, waiting. Her small fingers slipped into his, tentative but firm, and together they walked toward the car. Julie felt something she hadn't dared to hope for, the faintest flicker of safety. Julie's feet sank slightly into the plush carpet as she stepped into Gabriel's mansion. She hesitated just inside the doorway, the expanse of the gleaming marble foyer stretching out before her like the entrance to an entirely different world. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the kind of scent she only caught in passing near fancy storefronts. Here, it lingered, wrapping around her in a way that felt strangely suffocating. Her fingers brushed against the wall as she steadied herself, the cool smoothness beneath her fingertips foreign. She looked down, trying to process the stark difference between the polished floors and the rough pavement she had known for so long. The faint vibration of a distant grandfather clock hummed through her feet, a steady rhythm that was unfamiliar, yet oddly calming. She tilted her head, observing the way the sunlight streaming through high windows turned the room into a symphony of light and shadow. Gabriel stood a few steps ahead, watching her. Despite the loosening of his tie and the slight softening of his suit after a long day, his posture remained steady. He gestured gently toward the room beyond. "Go ahead," he said, speaking slowly enough for her to catch the words. "This is your home now." Julie blinked, her gaze darting to his lips, then back to the room. She took a tentative step forward. Her hand brushed against the arm of a leather chair, and she pulled it back quickly, as though she'd touched something forbidden. Not only was the furniture here clean, but it was untouched, pristine, as if it existed solely for admiration, not for use. "You can sit," Gabriel added, his voice low and calm. He motioned toward the chair. "It's okay." Julie hesitated again, then perched on the very edge, her small frame barely making an imprint on the cushion. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her eyes darted toward Gabriel, as though expecting him to tell her she'd done something wrong. The door slammed shut behind them, jolting her. She turned sharply, her eyes wide. A woman stood there, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached. Her tailored dress clung perfectly to her figure, her hair swept into a tight chignon that spoke of careful precision. "Gabrielle," the woman said, her voice crisp and edged with irritation. She barely glanced at Julie before fixing her gaze on her husband. "What's this?" Julie shrank back slightly, her hands curling into fists. She didn't need to hear the exact words to understand the tone. The woman's eyes darted toward her, assessing the situation, before returning to Gabriel. "This is Julie," Gabriel said evenly, stepping slightly in front of the chair as though shielding Julie from the intensity of the woman's scrutiny. "She'll be staying with us." The woman, Stephanie, Julie realized as Gabriel said her name, arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Staying with us?" she repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. Her lips tightened, but her expression quickly smoothed into something less obvious. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't outright hostility either. It was the kind of cool indifference that could cut deeper than outright anger. Julie glanced between them, her shoulders hunching instinctively. Despite her inability to follow the rapid exchange of words, the sharp movements of Stephanie's lips and the clipped gestures of her hands conveyed her unwelcome presence. Gabriel turned back to Julie, his expression softening as he crouched slightly to her level. "You're safe here," he said, his words deliberate and slow. His gaze held hers for a moment, steady and unwavering, before he straightened. Stephanie folded her arms, her nails tapping lightly against her elbow. "This wasn't exactly a discussion, Gabriel," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "You can't just bring someone home like this." Julie caught a word or two. Home. Someone. And understood enough to know that Stephanie was talking about her. She dropped her gaze to her hands, the tension in the room pressing down on her like the weight of an unfamiliar blanket. "She's staying," Gabriel replied, his voice final. He turned to Julie again, his expression softening once more. "Come on," he said, motioning toward the staircase. "Let me show you your room." Julie stood hesitantly, her movements small and careful, as though she were trying to take up as little space as possible. As she followed Gabriel up the grand staircase, she couldn't help but glance back. Stephanie remained motionless, her eyes unreadable and cold, as she closely observed their every step. The staircase felt endless, the opulence of the house becoming heavier with each step. Julie's fingers grazed the sleek railing, attempting to comprehend the unfamiliar, quiet realm she had entered. A realm that simultaneously felt more secure and confining than the streets she had abandoned. When Gabriel finally stopped in front of a door and pushed it open, Julie's breath caught. The room was small but immaculate, the bed dressed in crisp linens, a soft rug covering the floor. She stepped inside cautiously, her feet sinking into the plush carpet once more. It felt too much, too soft, too foreign. "Everything here is yours," Gabriel said. He leaned down slightly, catching her uncertain gaze. "Take your time. You'll become accustomed to it." Julie nodded, but her fingers tightened into small fists at her sides. Somewhere beneath the quiet elegance of the house, she could feel the undercurrent of tension that lingered in Stephanie's sharp gaze. And for all Gabriel's reassurances, safe was a word Julie wasn't sure she understood yet. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows in Julie's room felt softer today, though she wasn't sure if it was the light itself or the quiet moments she was starting to notice. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, she ran her fingers over the notebook Gabriel had handed her that morning. It was small, bound in worn leather, the kind of thing that seemed out of place in her hands. Gabriel had given it to her after breakfast, an awkward meal shared in near silence. He had slid the notebook across the table with a pen balanced on top, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "For drawing," he'd said slowly, letting each word hang for her to catch. "Or writing. Whatever you want." Julie had blinked at him, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't drawn anything since her mother passed, and the idea of writing her thoughts felt too intimate. But Gabriel's expression was steady, without expectation. She accepted it, nodding once, before tucking it under her arm. Now, in the stillness of her room, she hesitated. The pen hovered above the first page, the faint scratch of metal against paper breaking the silence. Her grip tightened as she began tracing the faint outlines of shapes, circles, swirls, patterns that emerged without much thought. "Everything okay?" Gabriel's voice startled her. Julie looked up, capturing his lips as they formed the question. He stood in the doorway, his tie absent, sleeves rolled up as though he'd left his usual composure somewhere else. He pointed to the notebook. "Do you like it?" She gave a small nod, her fingers tightening protectively around the edge of the pages. Gabriel moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed, but leaving space between them. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. On it, simple hand-drawn symbols and letters formed a guide, gestures paired with their meanings. "I thought this might help," he said, holding it out. Julie hesitated before taking it, scanning the drawings. Simple signs like "thank you" and "sorry" stood out, drawn in clean lines with clear instructions. She looked at him, her eyebrows knitting together in something close to confusion. "We'll practice," he said, his tone light but firm. "Together." He raised a hand, showing her the sign for hello. She stared, her hands unmoving, and he tried again. "Like this," he said, repeating the gesture. Julie's fingers twitched, then slowly mirrored his motion. Her hand felt clumsy, the movement stiff, but Gabriel smiled as though she'd done something extraordinary. "Good," he said, his voice steady. "That's good." Downstairs, Stephanie paced the length of the dining room, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor. The faint sounds of Gabriel's voice upstairs grated against her nerves. Days had passed since he welcomed Julie into their home, and Stephanie's patience was dwindling. At lunch, she didn't bother hiding her irritation. As Julie picked carefully at her plate, Stephanie set her glass of water down with a little more force than necessary. "This arrangement," she began, glancing at Gabriel, "isn't sustainable." Gabriel looked up from his meal, his expression calm but sharp. "What exactly do you mean?" "She's a child," Stephanie said, her voice low but cutting. "And not just any child. She's difficult. Do you think you can handle this on your own?" Julie's fork paused mid-air, her body stilling as she looked towards Stephanie's lips. The words weren't entirely clear, but the tone carried enough weight to fill in the gaps. "She's not a burden," Gabriel said, his voice steady, but there was a warning in it. Stephanie leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I didn't say she was. But let's be honest. This is your project, Gabriel. I was not questioned about it. And now we are all expected to pretend that this is a routine occurrence." Julie's fingers tightened around her fork, the metal cold against her skin. She lowered her gaze to her plate, focusing on the small bites she had left. The walls of the dining room seemed taller, the silence between words heavier. Gabriel exhaled sharply, setting his napkin on the table. "If you're trying to make her feel unwelcome, Stephanie, you're doing a fantastic job." "I'm being realistic," Stephanie shot back, though her voice softened slightly. "You can't fix everything with good intentions." Julie swallowed hard, her chest tightening as she pushed her plate away. She slipped out of her chair quietly, her steps soft but quick. She didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation to know she was the topic. Later that evening, Julie sat curled in the corner of her bed, the notebook resting on her knees. The drawings from earlier stared back at her, their lines blurred under dim light. She flipped to a blank page and began writing, the letters uneven but deliberate. "I'm not a burden." For a moment, she stared at the words, her throat tightening. Then, as if to reclaim the space, she turned the page and began drawing again. Swirls and shapes took form beneath her pen, each line an act of quiet defiance. In the hallway, Gabriel paused outside her door, the faint sound of pen scratching against paper reaching his ears. He didn't knock, giving her the space she clearly needed. But as he walked away, his jaw tightened. The gaps between them were closing, but the bridge wasn't built yet. Gabriel leaned against the kitchen counter, the early morning light slicing through the blinds in thin ribbons. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood settling, but his mind hummed with restless thoughts. Julie's silence had begun to weigh on him, not her lack of sound, but the unspoken walls she carried with her. He thought about the way she'd flinched at Stephanie's remarks during lunch the day before, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her fork. She had slipped upstairs afterward, her movements so light they were nearly imperceptible. The child barely existed in the spaces she occupied, as though she believed taking up less room might make her presence more tolerable. Gabriel's fingers tapped against the counter. He couldn't shake the thought. Julie's silence mirrored his own. Not only did he frequently find himself alone in the expansive mansion, but he had established boundaries in his life, keeping others at a distance. And yet, here she was, a reflection of all he'd refrained from confronting. That afternoon, he stepped into the small audiology clinic downtown. The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow at his tailored suit, but her demeanor softened when he explained. "For your daughter?" she asked, her voice light. He hesitated for only a moment. "Yes." Julie sat on the edge of her bed, her notebook balanced on her knees. The shapes and words she'd scrawled across the pages earlier blurred together in her mind. She looked up when Gabriel appeared in the doorway, a small unmarked box in his hands. He walked in slowly, his usual steady presence. Setting the box on the bed, he crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "I have something for you," he said, his words deliberate. Julie tilted her head, her eyes flicking between the box and his face. Gabriel opened the lid to reveal a sleek hearing aid nestled in its case. He held it up carefully, ensuring she could see it from all angles before gesturing for her to come closer. "This will help," he said, his voice soft. Julie's brow furrowed, her fingers reaching out hesitantly. She touched the device with the same cautious reverence she'd shown toward the notebook. "It's for you," Gabriel continued. "To hear." He pointed to his ear, then to hers, mimicking how the hearing aid would fit. Her fingers trembled as she took it from him. Gabriel stayed patient, guiding her as she placed it over her ear. The first sensation was strange, a faint buzz that felt more like vibration than sound. Julie's hand shot up instinctively, her fingers brushing against the device as though to steady it. Then, as Gabriel adjusted a small dial, the world unfolded before her eyes. The hum of the house surrounded her, the faint rustle of fabric as Gabriel moved, the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She blinked, her eyes wide, her breath catching. "Julie," Gabriel said, his voice low but clear. Her gaze snapped to his face, watching his lips move. For the first time, the sound matched the shape of the words. "You're safe now," he said. Julie's chest tightened. She didn't know how to respond. The sensation of sound was overwhelming, a flood of vibrations and clarity she hadn't expected. But Gabriel's words, simple, steady, anchored her. She nodded once, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed. Stephanie stood in the doorway of the dining room later that evening, her arms crossed. She watched Gabriel help Julie adjust the hearing aid again, his patience unwavering as he repeated words for her to match with the sounds. "This is excessive," Stephanie said, her tone sharp. Gabriel didn't look up. "What's excessive about helping her?" Stephanie scoffed, stepping further into the room. "She doesn't need all this. You're expending resources on an unsolvable issue. She's still her." At that, Gabriel's head lifted. His gaze locked on hers, cold and unyielding. "And what does that mean?" Stephanie faltered, but only slightly. "It means you can't fix everything by pretending she belongs here." "Stephanie," Gabriel said, his voice low, deliberate. "She's not a problem to solve. She's a person. A child who's been through more than either of us can imagine." Julie glanced between them, her posture shrinking slightly as Stephanie's gaze flickered toward her. "You think this is enough?" Stephanie asked, her voice hardening again. "Giving her toys, hearing aids, rooms? You're not her father, Gabriel." He stood, his full height imposing as he stepped toward her. "No," he said quietly. "However, I am the only one who is making an effort to be present." Stephanie's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. She pivoted sharply, her footsteps echoing sharply on the polished floor as she departed the room. Julie sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. Gabriel crouched beside her again, his expression softening. "Don't worry about her," he said, his words deliberate for her to follow. Julie nodded slowly, her fingers brushing against the hearing aid again. The world felt louder now, heavier in ways she hadn't expected, but for the first time, she felt like she was a part of it. The house was silent. It was a different kind of quiet than Julie had grown used to. With the hearing aid, the night now carried a texture of sound, a faint creak of wood as the house settled, the distant rustle of wind brushing past the windows. But it wasn't comforting. It pressed on her, amplifying the tension she had felt since dinner. She sat by the edge of her bed, gripping the notebook in her lap. Pages filled with half-formed drawings and scattered words stared back at her, offering no answers. Stephanie's voice from earlier echoed in her memory, sharp and cutting, though she hadn't caught every word. "You're not her father, Gabriel." Julie clenched her fists. She had seen the way Stephanie's gaze lingered on her, as though she were a problem that needed solving. No matter how patient Gabriel was, no matter how many gifts he gave her, Julie couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. She glanced at the door. The hallway beyond was dark, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, the only sign of life in the sprawling mansion. Her gaze shifted to the window. The world outside felt vast and dangerous, but it also felt like freedom. Her breathing quickened as she made her decision. She slipped on her shoes, the movement slow and deliberate. She didn't want to wake Gabriel. She couldn't face him, not when she was about to leave the safety he had worked so hard to give her. She didn't want to be a burden any longer. Julie pulled on her coat, grabbing her notebook as she eased open the door. The hallway stretched before her, the faint light from the moon filtering through distant windows. She moved carefully, avoiding the creakiest parts of the floor, until she reached the front door. The cool metal of the doorknob felt like a final barrier. Her hand lingered for a moment before she turned it, the soft click of the lock barely audible. With one last glance back at the darkened staircase, she stepped outside. The streets of San Diego at night felt alien. The warmth of the day had vanished, replaced by a chill that bit through her coat. Julie walked aimlessly, the city unfolding around her in faint vibrations and muted lights. She clutched her notebook to her chest, her fingers tight around its edges. The occasional sound of distant laughter or a passing car made her jump. She kept her head low, her steps hurried, but directionless. The city, so full of life during the day, felt vast and indifferent now. Julie's stomach churned. She hadn't thought this far ahead. Where would she go? She couldn't return to the streets she had once known. They were filled with memories of hunger, fear, and loss. "Lost, aren't you?" The voice startled her. She turned sharply, her eyes wide as she looked up at the man who had appeared beside her. He was tall, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a nearby street lamp. Julie stepped back, clutching her notebook tighter. "Hello, hello," the man uttered, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "I didn't mean to scare you." Her gaze darted to his lips, trying to piece together his words. "You look familiar," he continued, stepping closer. "You're Sarah's kid, right?" "Julie." Julie froze. The mention of her mother's name sent a jolt through her. She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah, I knew your mum," the man said, his tone casual. "She talked about you all the time, said you were smart, strong." He smiled, the gesture small but disarming. "I can help you." Julie's throat tightened. She wanted to ask how he knew her mother, but the words felt stuck. Instead, she nodded cautiously. "Come on," the man said, motioning down the street. "It's not safe out here. I've got a place nearby. You can rest and get something to eat." Julie hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground. Something about the man felt off, but the promise of safety and the mention of her mother clouded her judgment. "Trust me," he said, his smile widening. "Your mum would have wanted this." Reluctantly, Julie followed him, her steps slow and uncertain. As they moved further from the faint glow of the city center, the streets grew darker, quieter. The man's voice became a low hum of reassurance, though she barely caught the words. Julie's grip on her notebook tightened. Somewhere deep inside, unease began to bubble. But it was too late to turn back now. Back at the mansion, Gabriel woke to the unsettling silence of an empty house. He glanced at the clock, well past midnight. Something gnawed at him, a feeling of wrongness he couldn't shake. He moved toward Julie's room, his footsteps quickening as he found her bed empty and the window slightly ajar. Panic surged through him. "Julie," he called, his voice echoing through the stillness. He rushed to the front door, throwing it open to the cold night air. The empty streets outside offered no clues, but Gabriel's chest tightened with determination. He wasn't about to let her disappear. Not again. Julie stared at the towering mansion before her. Unlike Gabriel's home, which had been warm with sunlight and softened by personal touches, this place was cold and lifeless. The stone facade loomed darkly against the night sky, its sharp edges casting jagged shadows over the gravel driveway. The air felt heavy, stagnant, as though even the wind avoided this place. Zachary opened the door, gesturing for her to enter. "Come on, kid," he said, his tone less kind now that they were away from the streetlights. Julie hesitated, gripping her notebook tightly, but the sharp look in his eyes left her with little choice. She stepped inside. The interior was no better. Marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the harsh light of an overhead chandelier. The walls were bare, save for a few framed paintings that seemed more like afterthoughts than deliberate decor. Each step she took echoed, the sound bouncing off the cavernous space and making her feel smaller. "You'll wait here," Zachary said, leading her to a small side room. The furniture was sparse, a worn sofa and a low coffee table scattered with old magazines. He pointed to the sofa. "Sit." Julie obeyed, lowering herself cautiously onto the edge of the cushion. The fabric was scratchy against her fingers, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Zachary disappeared down the hallway, leaving her alone. She clutched her notebook to her chest, the familiar texture grounding her in the unfamiliar space. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before a heavy-set man entered the room. His footsteps were deliberate, the kind that made the floor tremble slightly. He stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "So," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "this is Sarah's kid." Julie didn't need an introduction to know who he was. Raymond. She recognized the name from her mother's whispered conversations late at night, her voice thick with worry. Julie's fingers tightened around her notebook, her knuckles turning white. Raymond didn't sit. He loomed over her, a looming figure against the sterile backdrop of the room. "Your mum owed me," he said bluntly. "A lot. And now, she's not around to pay." Julie's breath hitched. She wanted to speak, to defend her mother, but her voice failed her. She could only stare, her chest tight with fear. Raymond crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to her eye level. "You understand, don't you?" he said, his lips curling into a mockery of a smile. "Debts don't just disappear. Someone's got to pay. She nodded stiffly, her throat burning with unshed tears. "Good," he said, standing back up. "Then you'll work. Do what I say when I say it. Maybe then we'll call it even." Days went by, but Julie couldn't recall the exact number. The mansion, for all its size, felt like a prison. They assigned her menial tasks, such as scrubbing floors, polishing furniture, and cleaning never-used rooms. The work was relentless, her small hands raw from hours of scrubbing. The house was always cold, no matter how many layers she wore. And unlike Gabriel's home, where the silence had carried a sense of peace, here it was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint murmur from behind closed doors felt like a warning. Zachary's presence was constant, his sharp eyes tracking her movements like a predator watching prey. He didn't speak much, but his sneers and pointed gestures made it clear that she wasn't welcome, just useful. Julie didn't cry. She did not cry when her arms ached from carrying heavy buckets, when her stomach growled from missing meals, or when the weight of her situation pressed so heavily on her chest that she could barely breathe. Instead, she focused on small acts of defiance. She kept her notebook hidden, tucked safely under the thin mattress in the servants' quarters, where she slept. Late at night, when the house finally fell silent, she would pull it out, drawing or writing by the faint glow of a single bulb overhead. Her sketches grew darker, shapes of towering shadows and jagged lines. But amidst them, she would sometimes draw a sunbeam cutting through the darkness, a fragile reminder of Gabriel's promise. "You're safe now." One evening, as she scrubbed the base of a grand staircase, Zachary approached her, his heavy boots stopping inches from her hands. "You think this is bad?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You should be grateful. Raymond's giving you a chance to pay your mother's debts. Most people don't get that." Julie didn't look up. She kept scrubbing, her hands trembling slightly, but never stopping. "You'll break eventually," Zachary said, leaning down so his face was level with hers. "Kids like you always do." Julie met his gaze, her own filled with quiet determination. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. She wouldn't break. Zachary straightened, sneering. "We'll see." Later that night, Julie sat on her narrow bed, the notebook open in her lap. Her fingers moved instinctively, drawing a small house with tall windows and soft light spilling out. A memory of Gabriel's home. She paused, her chest tightening with longing. For now, she was trapped in Raymond's world. But somewhere deep inside, she held on to hope. She had escaped once before, and she would again. Gabriel's eyes scanned the darkened streets of San Diego, the faint glow of street lamps casting long shadows over the pavement. Weeks had passed since Julie's disappearance, and every moment without her felt like an unhealing wound. His chest tightened with frustration and guilt, his thoughts a relentless loop of what-ifs and should-haves. He'd tried everything, visiting shelters, asking shop owners, even going to neighborhoods he'd avoided for years. Each lead ended in the same hollow disappointment. The vast and indifferent city seemed to engulf Julie, leaving no trace behind. Gabriel leaned against the hood of his car, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. He picked up his phone and called another number from the list of possible sources. "Still no sign of her," he muttered to the person on the other end. His voice was rough, worn down by sleepless nights and the weight of responsibility. "Just let me know if you hear anything, okay?" When the call ended, Gabriel remained where he was, staring at the distant horizon. A change of scenery might give you some perspective. Gabriel frowned, leaning back in his chair. He had little interest in visiting Stephanie's brother. Raymond's reputation was hardly stellar, and Gabriel often found his arrogance insufferable. But Stephanie's suggestion carried a hint of logic. Perhaps stepping away, even briefly, would help him regain focus. "Fine," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "We'll go tomorrow." The drive to Raymond's mansion was tense, the silence between Gabriel and Stephanie heavy with unspoken judgments. As the car turned onto the winding road leading to Raymond's estate, Gabriel couldn't shake a sense of unease. The mansion came into view, a cold, imposing structure that seemed to rise from the earth like a fortress. Its sharp lines and towering gates were a stark contrast to Gabriel's warm, welcoming home. As they stepped inside, Gabriel immediately felt the chill in the air. The walls were bare, the furniture functional, but devoid of comfort. A butler greeted them with a stiff bow before leading them into a vast sitting room. "Raymond will be with you shortly," the butler announced before disappearing down a long hallway. Gabriel wandered toward the window, his gaze sweeping over the meticulously kept grounds. The silence of the house pressed against him, amplifying his unease. At that moment, he heard a faint, rhythmic sound that didn't belong there. He heard the sound of a broom swishing against the floor. Gabriel turned his head, the noise coming from a side corridor. "Stay here," he said to Stephanie, already moving toward the sound. A faint hum of activity guided him through the dimly lit hallway. When he turned the corner, his breath caught. Julie stood at the far end of the corridor, a bucket by her feet and a mop in her hands. Exhaustion dulled her once vivid eyes, making her movements mechanical and hesitant. The bright, curious girl he had brought into his home was now a shadow of herself. "Julie," Gabriel called, his voice breaking. She froze, her grip on the mop tightening as her head snapped toward him. For a moment, she didn't move, as though unsure if he was real. "Gabriel," she whispered, her voice trembling. He crossed the distance between them in a few strides, dropping to one knee to meet her gaze. His hands reached for hers, his eyes scanning her face for signs of injury. "What are you doing here? How?" Before he could finish, heavy footsteps echoed behind them. Gabriel turned to see Raymond, his expression darkening as realization dawned. "So," Raymond said, his tone casual but laced with malice. "You found her." Gabriel rose to his feet, placing himself protectively in front of Julie. "She's coming with me," he said, his voice low and firm. Raymond chuckled, crossing his arms. "Not so fast. She's paying off a debt her mother left behind. You wouldn't want to interfere with that, would you?" Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Name your price." Raymond's smirk faltered, replaced by a calculating gleam. "You think you can just buy her freedom?" "I'll pay whatever it takes," Gabriel said, his voice steady. "But she's leaving with me." Julie gripped Gabriel's arm, her small fingers trembling against his sleeve. A glimmer of hope sparked in her eyes. Raymond's laughter rang out, echoing through the sterile hallway like a cruel melody. He stepped closer, his imposing figure casting a long shadow that swallowed the faint flicker of hope in Julie's expression. "Always the savior, aren't you, Gabriel?" Raymond sneered. "You think you can throw your money at everything and fix it. Some things aren't that simple." Gabriel's eyes didn't waver. His frame, though tense, remained resolute. "This isn't about simplicity. It's about what's right. Tell me what you want, and let her go." Julie clung tighter to Gabriel's arm, her knuckles white. She couldn't find her voice, but her gaze darted between the two men, trying to decipher the battle of wills unfolding before her. Raymond smirked, his calculating eyes scanning Gabriel. "You're serious, aren't you? Why are you making such a big deal about a child you've only known for a few months?" Gabriel stepped forward, his tone piercing through the tension like a blade. "She's not a fuss. She's a child who deserves better than this, better than having her own debts used as collateral." For a moment, Raymond's face hardened, his smirk slipping into something colder. But then he sighed dramatically, as if bored. "Fine. Let's talk numbers." Julie's heart pounded as she sat in the corner of Raymond's study, the dim light casting shadows over the stacks of papers cluttering the desk. Gabriel stood across from Raymond, his voice low but firm as they argued over figures. She couldn't believe he was here. For weeks, she had convinced herself that no one was looking for her, that she'd been forgotten. Yet here he was, standing between her and the man who had stripped her of her dignity. "Julie," Gabriel said suddenly, breaking her train of thought. Her head snapped up and her eyes met his. He crouched before her, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. "We're leaving," he said, his words deliberate for her to follow. "Now." Julie hesitated, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. You're taking me," she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. Gabriel's grip tightened around her hand. "Of course. You're coming home." Her chest tightened, a flood of emotions rushing in at once, relief, gratitude, and the faintest spark of hope. She let him pull her to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. Raymond's voice interrupted the moment. "You're making a mistake, Gabriel." Gabriel turned, his expression sharp. The only mistake would have been leaving her here. Raymond's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. Gabriel guided Julie out of the room, his hand firm yet gentle on her shoulder. When they reached the car, Stephanie was waiting, her arms crossed and her expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. "What is this?" she demanded, as Gabriel opened the passenger door for Julie. "She's coming home," Gabriel said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Stephanie's eyes narrowed, her gaze darting to Julie, who sat silently in the car, clutching her notebook. "You can't be serious. You went to Raymond's house for this? For her?" Gabriel closed the car door with a deliberate motion before turning to face his wife. "Yes, for her." Stephanie let out a bitter laugh. "You've lost your mind. You're prioritizing this girl over everything. Over your life, your reputation, your marriage." Gabriel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "This isn't about choosing between Julie and anything else. This is about doing what's right." "What's right?" Stephanie snapped, her voice rising. "What's right is focusing on us, on fixing this mess you've dragged us into." Gabriel took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "The only mess here is letting you believe that turning our backs on a child in need is acceptable. If you can't see why she matters, that's on you." Stephanie stared at him, her expression a mixture of anger and something unreadable. Finally, she scoffed and turned away, muttering under her breath as she climbed into the car. The drive back to Gabriel's mansion was silent, save for the hum of the engine. Julie sat in the back seat, her hands gripping her notebook like a lifeline. She didn't dare speak, her mind still reeling from the events of the evening. When they arrived, Gabriel opened her door, helping her out with the same care he'd shown the first day she arrived. He knelt beside her, his voice soft. "You're safe now," he said, echoing the words that had once brought her comfort. Julie nodded, tears brimming in her eyes, but refusing to fall. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe him. As they walked toward the house, Stephanie lingered by the car, her arms crossed tightly. Her expression was unreadable, but Gabriel didn't spare her a glance. His focus was on Julie, and for now, that was all that mattered. Inside, Julie hesitated in the foyer, the warmth of the house washing over her like a balm. Gabriel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're home," he said. Julie stood in the hallway of Gabriel's mansion, her hand brushing against the smooth wooden banister. The warmth of the house enveloped her, the faint smell of lavender in the air stirring memories of her first day here. But everything felt different now. She felt different, worn, fragile, yet somehow stronger. Her hearing aid picked up the faint hum of the house, the grandfather clock ticking steadily, the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen. These sounds, once foreign and overwhelming, now offered a strange comfort. She clutched her notebook tightly, as if holding on to the part of herself that had survived Raymond's house. "Julie," Gabriel's voice called from the kitchen. She turned, focusing on his lips as he spoke slowly. "Come have breakfast. You need to eat." She nodded, her steps hesitant but purposeful as she made her way to the table. The smell of fresh toast and eggs greeted her, and for a moment she felt a pang of gratitude so deep it left her breathless. Gabriel watched as Julie carefully buttered her toast, her movements deliberate, almost timid. She had been back for only a few days, but he could already see the toll her time with Raymond had taken. Her once vivid expressions had dulled, replaced by a quiet reserve that broke his heart. But there were moments, fleeting, fragile, when she looked at him with the same glimmer of trust she'd shown before she disappeared. "I was thinking," Gabriel began, his tone gentle. "We can start practicing more words today, if you're ready?" Julie paused mid-bite, then nodded. She reached for her notebook, flipping to a blank page. Her pencil moved in slow, careful strokes. "Thank you." Gabriel smiled. "You don't need to thank me, Julie. I'm just glad you're here." Her gaze dropped, her cheeks flushing slightly. But there was a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, a small victory that Gabriel quietly cherished. Upstairs, Stephanie stood by the window of their bedroom, watching the quiet interaction below. Her arms were crossed, her posture rigid as she observed the scene unfolding in the kitchen. Her jaw tightened as she watched Gabriel lean toward Julie, pointing at the notebook with a patience that seemed infinite. She had seen this side of him before, the unwavering focus, the ability to pour himself entirely into something. But now, it wasn't for her. "He's wasting his energy," she muttered to herself, turning away from the window. The resentment that had been simmering since Julie's arrival was now boiling over. Stephanie couldn't understand how Gabriel had become so invested in this girl, to the point of risking their reputation and marriage. "You're letting her replace everything," she had told him the night before, her voice sharp with anger. But Gabriel had only stared at her, his silence more infuriating than any argument. Stephanie sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of her thoughts pressing heavily on her chest. She felt like an outsider in her own home, watching as her husband drifted further from her and closer to a girl she couldn't bring herself to accept. In the weeks that followed, Julie threw herself into learning. Gabriel had written out a simple guide of words and phrases for her to practice, pairing them with gestures to help her understand. In the quiet afternoons, they sat together at the dining room table, the notebook between them as Julie carefully mimicked his signs. "You're doing great," Gabriel said one day after she successfully signed her name. Julie's lips quirked into a small smile. "Hard," she signed, her movement slow but deliberate. Gabriel nodded. "It's hard now, but you're getting better every day. Don't give up." She looked at him then, her eyes softening. In that moment, she realized he wasn't just teaching her words. He was teaching her how to believe in herself again. Stephanie's distance from the two only grew. She avoided the dining room during their lessons, choosing instead to stay upstairs or leave the house altogether. One evening, as she stood in the doorway watching Gabriel and Julie laugh over a shared mistake, something inside her cracked. She turned away quickly, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. In her room, she sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkened sky. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if her anger toward Julie was misplaced. Was she jealous of a child? But the thought of admitting that, even to herself, felt impossible. Late one night, Julie sat in her room, the notebook open in her lap. The words she had learned that day were scrawled across the page in neat rows. At the bottom, she had drawn a small house, its windows glowing with light. She touched the drawing lightly, her chest tightening with emotion. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear or despair. Down the hall, Gabriel watched the faint light under her door. He leaned against the wall, exhaustion tugging at his features. But despite everything, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. Julie was back, and slowly, she was finding her way. Stephanie's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "You're choosing her over everything." He shook his head, dismissing the thought. This wasn't a choice. It was a responsibility, a promise he had made to himself the moment he had brought Julie into his home, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The air in the mansion felt heavier now. Time had reshaped the house into something quieter, more solemn. The absence of Gabriel resonated through the halls like the fading notes of a familiar melody. The smell of lavender still lingered faintly, but it no longer carried the same warmth for Julie. She stood in the study, now hers by inheritance, running her fingers over the smooth wood of Gabriel's desk. It was the same desk where he'd once written her lessons, his neat handwriting carefully forming words to teach her. Now, scattered papers bore her own handwriting, bills, documents, estate plans. Julie, now 30, had stepped into Gabriel's role with a grace forged through years of hardship. Her sharp features, softened by kindness, reflected the strength and resilience he had always believed she possessed. But the loss of him weighed on her, a quiet ache that never quite left her chest. Gabriel's passing had been sudden, a heart attack one morning as he prepared for his usual routine. Julie had found him in the kitchen, the coffee cup still warm in his hand. In that moment, her world seemed to stop. The sounds from her hearing aid cutting into sharp fragments of reality, the ticking clock, her own panicked breaths, the faint creak of the floor as she fell to her knees beside him. The days that followed blurred into a haze of grief. People she barely knew arrived to offer condolences, their words well-meaning but hollow. Stephanie had sat stiffly in the corner during the funeral, her face pale but composed. Julie, however, couldn't afford to crumble. There was too much to do. Weeks turned into months, and Julie threw herself into managing Gabriel's estate. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a monument to the man who had saved her. She walked its halls daily, ensuring everything was in order, from the staff schedules to the upkeep of the garden Gabriel had loved. Stephanie, now in her 60s, had grown frail. Her sharp demeanor had dulled with age, but her words still carried a sting. "I don't need your pity," she snapped one afternoon when Julie brought her tea. Julie set the tray down gently on the table, her expression calm. "It's not pity, Stephanie. It's tea." Stephanie's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the cup. She muttered a reluctant, "Thank you," but avoided Julie's gaze. Their interactions remained strained, though the dynamic had shifted. Stephanie, once commanding and unyielding, now relied on Julie for everything. And Julie, despite the bitterness she had faced for years, cared for Stephanie with patience and quiet dignity. One evening, Julie found herself sitting by the fireplace, a stack of old photographs spread out before her. She picked up one of Gabriel's, his warm smile frozen in time. He had been holding her notebook in the picture, pointing at a word she had written. She remembered that day vividly, the pride in his voice when she had signed her first full sentence. A sound behind her drew her attention. Stephanie stood in the doorway, her figure silhouetted by the dim light of the hall. "You miss him," Stephanie said, her voice quieter than Julie had ever heard it. Julie nodded, setting the photograph down. "Every day." Stephanie hesitated before stepping into the room, her movements slow. She lowered herself into the armchair across from Julie, her hands gripping the armrests for support. "I didn't understand," Stephanie admitted, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I didn't understand why he cared so much, why he chose you." Julie remained silent, her heart aching at the rawness in Stephanie's tone. "But now," Stephanie continued, her voice trembling, "I see it. You gave him purpose." Julie looked at her, the walls between them seeming to crumble slightly. "He gave me everything," she said softly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence with its warmth. The mansion, despite its grandeur, no longer felt imposing to Julie. It had become her responsibility, her legacy. With the same integrity Gabriel had shown her, she managed the estate, ensuring the staff received good treatment and the house continued to serve as a refuge for those in need. Stephanie, though still distant, had softened in small ways. She no longer snapped at Julie's kindness, and sometimes, in quiet moments, she even offered a hesitant smile. Julie found solace in the garden, tending to the flowers Gabriel had loved. The act of nurturing something brought her closer to him, a quiet way of honoring the life he had given her. One rainy afternoon, Julie sat in the study, writing a letter to the foundation Gabriel had supported. The sound of Stephanie's cane tapping against the floor drew her attention. "I thought, maybe I could help," Stephanie said, holding a stack of old documents. Julie smiled, gesturing for her to sit. Together, they sorted through the papers, their movements slow but steady. For the first time in years, the mansion felt less heavy. Gabriel's absence was still deeply felt, but Julie had found her way through the grief. She carried his memory, not as a burden, but as a guide. Every decision she made, every act of kindness she showed, was a testament to the man who had saved her and taught her what it meant to love without condition. And slowly, in the quiet moments, Stephanie began to see it too. The cemetery overlooked the vast expanse of the ocean, the horizon blurring where the blue of the sky met the rolling waves. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the towering oak trees, their shadows dancing lightly on the cobblestone path. It was serene, a place where time seemed to slow, allowing grief and reflection to coexist in quiet harmony. Julie walked slowly, a bouquet of white lilies cradled in her arms. The flowers were fresh, their delicate petals almost glowing in the soft morning light. She measured her steps, each one a silent acknowledgement of the weight in her chest. She stopped in front of a modest gravestone, its polished surface bearing Gabriel's name and the years that framed his extraordinary life. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "A life of compassion, a legacy of love." Julie knelt, placing the lilies at the base of the stone. Her fingers lingered on the cool marble, tracing the letters of his name. "Hi, Gabriel," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I hope I'm doing this right. I hope I'm making you proud." The breeze picked up slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of salt water. Julie closed her eyes, letting the air wrap around her like an embrace. She whispered, her words almost lost in the wind. "You saved me. And I'll never stop trying to live the way you taught me, to care, to give, to love." Behind her, the sound of a cane tapping against the cobblestones drew closer. Stephanie appeared, her figure smaller now, her once sharp features softened by age and fragility. She paused a few steps behind Julie, her grip tightening on the cane as she observed the younger woman. Julie stood and turned, offering a small smile. Stephanie's gaze flickered to the flowers, then back to the gravestone. "You always bring lilies," Stephanie remarked, her tone neutral, but with a hint of curiosity. "They were his favorite," Julie replied simply. Stephanie nodded, her eyes lingering on the gravestone. "He would have liked this spot," she said after a moment. "Quiet, peaceful." Julie stepped aside as Stephanie moved closer, her steps deliberate, but unsteady. She stood before the gravestone, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I didn't say it enough," Stephanie began, her voice trembling slightly. "But he was a decent man." Julie nodded, watching her carefully. "He was," she said softly. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the sound of the waves below filling the air. Then Stephanie turned slightly, her gaze meeting Julie's. "I used to think you didn't belong," Stephanie admitted, her voice raw. "I thought you were taking him away from me, but I was wrong." Julie's chest tightened, but she stayed quiet, letting Stephanie continue. "You gave him purpose," Stephanie said, her tone softening. "And you've done more for this family than I ever thought possible. Gabriel saw it long before I did." Julie swallowed the lump in her throat, her hand brushing against the edge of the gravestone for support. "He believed in both of us, Stephanie," she said gently. "He never stopped." Stephanie's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the weight of her words had lifted something within her. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on Julie's arm. "Thank you," she said, the words quiet but sincere. Julie nodded, her own hand covering Stephanie's. "We'll keep making him proud." Together. They were still two separate figures, but for the first time, their shadows seemed to move as one. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.